So hey anime fans, the series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with Korra? So let's start the series. An older woman looked to her left and asked, laughing. So, are you excited? Hell yeah! Cried a teenage girl with excitement. I'm finally done with fire bending if I just beat this arrogant big shot's butt. The youngster in question had piercing blue eyes and darker complexion, which was a defining characteristic of Water Tribe members. Her brunette hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and a bundle of hair funneled through a blue sleeve framed her face on either side. Her arms and chest were currently covered in thick fur armor with a unique red leather coating. The pieces were secured in place by multiple leather straps. The chest piece protruded from her front and back and extended several inches down her thighs. The helmet that was tucked under her arm appeared to be an extra piece of armor. The beginning of a light blue top beneath her chest piece, loose-fitting dark blue leggings, and furred leather boots were visible beneath the armor. These pieces of clothing looked far more Water Tribe-esque than the items that were placed on top of them. After her initial outburst, she rephrased, I mean yes, Master Katara, while pretending to cough. When she reacted so early in the morning, the older men and women standing next to her simply perspired, dismissing it as the teen's excitement. But one man wearing traditional Fire Nation robes took the chance to reply. I assure you, Avatar Korra, that this is not some cocky big shot. As you've so eloquently stated, I trained him in the basics personally when he was younger, and he was later personally tutored by Lord Zuko. Naturally, the guy who had spoken had been Korra's firebending teacher for the previous 2 years. The people standing beside him were Katara and some of the top-ranking White Lotus members, all of whom were dressed in traditional White Lotus garb. Korra said with a sigh, Oh whatever, he just sounds like some big shot noble from the Fire Nation. With a smile still plastered on her creased face, Katara gently reprimanded Korra from the side, saying, I think you would do well to keep your mind open to the possibilities, Korra. I've actually heard a lot about this boy myself, a remark her late husband often used. The Avatar looked to her waterbending instructor and asked, Really? With a raised eyebrow. Oh yes, the elderly lady replied with a smile. Zuko tends to drone on about him quite a bit when he finds time to write to me. Even Tenzin had mentioned the boy quite a bit in the last 2 years or so in his letters since the boy moved to Republic City from the Fire Nation, or actually moved back, I believe. I must say, from how they describe him, I'm a bit excited to finally meet him myself. I highly doubt he'll be like the other royals you've had to meet with already. As the adolescent absorbed the information Katara had provided, the ancient fire-bending instructor raised an eyebrow and remarked, You do remember the title he has obtained, do you not, Korra? Korra fought the impulse to scratch the back of her head and asked, Yeah, the Dragon of the East or something like that, right? She wasn't exactly the best at memorizing titles that were given to most people, after all. The old man nodded his head and repeated, The Dragon of the East, to reaffirm her response. However, as you are undoubtedly aware, the Fire Nation has long since abandoned the practice of hunting dragons, so tell me, how do you think one gets such a highly coveted title nowadays? He concluded, looking over at Korra and raising an eyebrow. I figured he probably just got it for being a member of the royal family or being related to Iroh, she said sheepishly after there had been a brief pause. No, even members of the royal family do not get to claim the title of dragon without just cause, the elderly man replied with a disappointed shake his head. Besides, even if that were the case, it's highly unlikely that Lord Naruto of all people would be shown any nepotism in that regard. While he is considered to be a member of the royal family unofficially, he is not related to them by legitimate blood ties. That is merely a common misconception, all right. So how'd he get it? Korra inquired, her eagerness palpable in her voice. Naturally, everyone looked up into the area of the sky where the sound had come from right away. A black form appeared on the horizon from the northwest, just now visible over the tall walls surrounding the compound, and it was gradually getting bigger. Although most of the finer details were not visible from a distance, the distinct shape of large wings flapping up and down was definitely visible already. Korra emphasized each word as she said, "No freaking way! Is that? Why, yes, that would be him," the elderly firebending instructor said, chuckling softly at the opportune moment. "Lord Naruto, the Dragon of the East, underscore 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 as he rubbed a spot along the head of the enormous, black, Eastern-style dragon he was now riding atop, the guy remarked. Hee, awesome job, boy, prompting the beast to hum slightly in response to his roar. There's no way they didn't hear that, he muttered. As one might expect, the majestic creature's mane scales and wing webbing were black, but it also had curved horns, spikes and slight webbing between the spikes down its body, frill of hair around its face, and at the tip of its tail that were all black. Its underbelly, which included the underside of its lower jaw, and its two tendrils were dark gray, which seemed to go well with the black scales that made up the majority of its body. The creature's talons and teeth were a pristine white, and its appearance was completed by two sky-blue eyes that peered towards the compound it was flying towards. A medium-sized saddle that held the dragon's rider was wrapped around the base of its head because it wouldn't fit well anywhere else because of the spikes that ran along its spine. The saddle wasn't meant to look formal, as evidenced by the absence of any designs on the leather, but rather served as a riding saddle that offered the rider some degree of comfort in case he had to sit so that his body wouldn't be rubbed raw against the hard scales. A large bag secured to the leather with thick string was resting on the saddle, close to the rough leather that created a type of makeshift ledge around its borders. Naturally, Naruto was seated at the front of the saddle. He was a man who, when standing up straight, appeared to be about 6 feet 2. His hair appeared to be a rare shade of golden blonde, which was unusual because blonde hair was already uncommon in the world. In addition, his hair had an unusual amount of spikiness that made it appear to defy gravity, which would attract a lot of attention. His eyes appeared to be a piercing cerulean blue, only a shade or two darker than the dragon's own. Naruto's hair was short and lacked any kind of ceremonial knot in the back, unlike most men in the Fire Nation. His bangs mostly hung just above his brow, but two long ones at the edges of his hairline went down to his cheeks, effectively framing his face. While his eyes and hair were undoubtedly striking features, the most noticeable would probably be the 3 whisker marks he had on either cheek. Apart from that, the blonde was dressed in what many older people would identify as a slightly altered version of the attire Zuko wore when he was traveling casually in his prime. He wore what appeared to be a form-fitting, long-sleeved black shirt because the layer of fine black cloth over his visible arm area was like a second skin, highlighting the toned muscle of his biceps. On top of that was a sleek piece of leather Fire Nation chest armor that also served as basic shoulder guards. The armor was crimson with black trim along the edges of the chest, but it was only visible at the shoulders and collar because of another layer of clothing that rested on top of it. Lastly, he wore a sleeveless kimono-style shirt that was crimson and sleeveless. The front of the shirt ended at his waist, but the back extended down to his calves. He wore leather armguards that appeared to be the exact color of his exposed shoulder pads, covering his arms from just below his elbow to his wrist. His hands were then covered by a pair of fingerless black gloves made of the same fine material as his black shirt. The next noteworthy piece of armor would be his rather large belt, which was a fitted piece of dark-colored metal that rested on his hips. The Fire Nation's highly polished gold insignia was in the center of the belt, and underneath it were two pouches, one of which was effectively held at each of the blonde's hips, with the other strap for each strap being secured under the back of his belt. A thin black sheath and the bandage-wrapped hilt for a jian with a small, golden pommel were located beneath the pouch on his left hip. A rather elegant piece of cloth that fell to his knees was also attached to the belt. The centerpiece, which was crimson in the center and had black trim to match the color of the rest of his armor, fell between his legs. Two smaller pieces of similarly colored cloth then framed the piece with tiny flame patterns on the side nearest the centerpiece. Although this cloth was primarily worn for aesthetic reasons, it also made sure that the long back of his kimono didn't swing completely in front of him and significantly impede his movement. On top of that, he wore loose, plain black pants that were mostly obscured by the cloth that hung from his belt and his greaves, which, in keeping with the pre-established theme, were mainly crimson with black trim at the ankles and in the middle. A basic pair of black shoes, which lacked the curved tips that the majority of Fire Nation residents appeared to wear, completed his costume. And if you're having trouble seeing his appearance as I've described it, try searching for Adult Zuko on a search engine, mentally rearranging the colors, changing the features and hair, tightening the shirt, and substituting a single jian for the swords. This will give you a broad sense. As they approached the compound they were supposed to land in, Naruto said, "Land us nice and easy, boy," moving forward a little and giving the dragon another pat on the back of the head. "No need to go scaring anyone here," he said. Yip with a sigh, the blonde went back to his usual sitting position and looked at the small ball of fur on his lap, a small fox kit that had been with him for as long as he could remember. It was strange enough that it was a creature that was rarely seen in their world, but even stranger was the fact that, despite being fed fairly well, it hadn't grown an inch since that day. The creature's 9 different tails that swished behind it, and its strangely human-like front paws, were the most bizarre features. If someone were to look closely, they would also notice that the fox had crimson-colored irises with a black slit for a pupil, a foreboding sight if ever there was one. The fox's fur was orange except for the black markings that went around its eyes and up into its inner ears. However, the two creatures were as much a part of his identity as a part of his body, and he wouldn't part with either of them if someone offered him the world on a silver platter. Naruto had even received numerous offers to purchase the fox, probably in an attempt to breed him, or treat him as a treasured possession, similar to what he had done for the creature he was currently riding. As he teasingly brushed a clothed hand over the creature's head, Naruto said, "Quiet you," adding, "No yipping this early in the morning." Naturally, he got a playful nip on the fingers in return. The teenager repeated the previous action with a little more force. "No biting, Kurama," which caused the fox to snarl slightly before it attempted to bite the blonde's hand once again but failed. The Fire Nation man said, "Ha, too slow," and then blew a soft raspberry. But he stopped teasing when his current mode of transportation started to slowly descend. As the blonde got closer to the ground, he looked at the figures on a large platform that were probably waiting for him to land. Given how close he had come, Naruto thought, well, I guess the one in red must be Korra. A smile slowly spread over his face until it was full-blown and revealed his immaculate teeth. This should definitely be fun, Naruto thought. The dragon descended slowly until it touched down, and when it did, it was clear that its body was so big that it covered at least 3/4 of the length of the raised stone platform it was landing on. After stopping and picking up Kurama from his lap, the blonde said, "Okay, show time." And then he stood up on the saddle. He placed the fox kit directly on his scalp, which is an unusual place to hold an animal, but Naruto already knew all too well that it was a spot the creature liked to claim as his perch. As the group of people shifted slightly to welcome him where he had landed, he leaped from the saddle with well-practiced grace. Nevertheless, he ignored them for the moment, and turned to face the dragon that had carried him this far. He met its eyes, put a hand under its jaw, and scratched the scales underneath, causing another faint hum. "I'll see if the White Lotus will bring you something to eat a little later, all right?" he said, lifting the clothed hand that had scratched his lower jaw and placing it on his snout. "Thanks, Iroh. We're probably going to be here for at least a day or two, so rest up while you can." The dragon, now known as Iroh, simply let out a breath and nodded his head slightly, indicating that he appeared to comprehend the blonde. "Great, now behave yourself, all right? I don't want to get grief about a charred White Lotus member later." Iroh responded to that final comment with a warm rush of air that was more than needed, indicating his mild annoyance. "Oh, come on, I wouldn't be me if I didn't pick on you at least little bit, buddy," Naruto said, laughing, as he patted his muzzle and made his way to the group that had been waiting for him for a short while. Despite the early hour of the morning, he looked around at everyone there. He swung his gaze to the next person and thought, 3 older folks dressed in formal White Lotus robes. I have absolutely no idea who they are. Ah, that's probably Katara," he continued, noticing an elderly woman wearing traditional Water Tribe attire. "Then Avatar Korra, obviously," he said, lingering on her appearance for a little longer than necessary before moving on to the last person in line. The slightly wide-eyed Korra, who was taking in his appearance along with the others who had never seen him before, was missing when Naruto abruptly exclaimed, "Master Lee!" as he walked forward. Without saying anything more, Naruto opened his arms and gave the slightly shorter man a fierce hug as he approached, shocking everyone even more. "It's so good to see you again," the teenager finally said as he released the man and backed away a few steps. The man bowed and said, "As it is you, Lord Naruto." "No, no, no," Naruto said, pushing the man back to his standing position and reaching a palm up to his bowed forehead. "No lord stuff and no bowing, you know that I hate those sorts of things, especially from you of all people," Naruto said. Seeing the blonde's eye twitch in response to his changed but equally accurate title, the elderly man said, "I see that the past few years haven't changed you very much, Councilman Naruto," with a slight smirk on his lips. "Regardless, thank you for making the trip here. I apologize for pulling you away from your yearly visit with Zuko," he said. The blonde said, "Bah, it isn't a big deal," with a laugh so contagious. "Besides, there's someone here that I've always wanted to meet anyway," she said. Korra straightened up a little at this point and was ready to welcome him appropriately, but she was truly taken aback when he passed her by and stood in front of her waterbending master. "Huh, this guy's definitely different," she thought, her brow slightly furrowed as she recalled how almost every royal she had ever met had immediately sucked up to her. Thus far, Naruto had not only seemed to be a more experienced fighter than the others based on his clothing choices and the muscles covering his arms, as evidenced by the bulges against the form-fitting shirt around his arms, but he also appeared to be kind and surprisingly informal. He definitely looks much better than the others as well, she thought, shivering at the thought of the numerous haughty and rather unsightly flirted with her since she had turned 15. It is an honor to finally meet you. I've heard a great deal about you and your adventures, Naruto said warmly to the elderly woman, blissfully oblivious to Korra's current thoughts. He then bowed slightly, lowering his hips in a gesture of respect. You must be Katara, Naruto said. Katara murmured softly, a smile widening across her wrinkled face. I've heard a lot about you as well though, Naruto, or should I call you the prank king of the royal palace? Please, after what you said a moment ago, there's no need for formalities here. The blonde hesitated for a while before grinning uneasily and nervously stroking the back of his head while his hands brushed Kurama's tails. He laughed as he recalled playing such practical jokes on some of the more haughty lords who would be in the palace almost every day. Zuko wrote about that of all things. Man, I miss those days, he added. Laughing uncontrollably, Katara said, Yes, he likes to ramble on about you quite a bit in his letters. My son did too, for that matter, though I am already beginning to see why that is the case, she said. Naruto laughed again and reached up to brush the fox on top of his head behind his ear after feeling it scrape his scalp a little. Tenzin? You would think he'd write about his own kids before taking the time to mention little old me, he said. He usually happens to mention you when he's talking about the others, Milo in particular. The elderly Water Tribe lady said, her smile growing slightly. The blonde shrugged his shoulders and said, Ah, well, what can I say? I always wanted a little sibling, and we've come to see each other as such, and we brothers gotta stick together, he concluded with a tiny smile. Well, I'm glad my grandchildren have such a good role model to look up to, she said, her smile widening slightly. But we can talk about Tenzin and the others later. Korra here has been looking forward to this for quite some time, she said, gesturing to her left. Naruto said, laughing, Well, I certainly can't say I haven't been doing the same. Turning to face the adolescent in question, and making his piercing blue eyes meet hers for the first time. It's an honor to meet you as well, Avatar Korra, he said, extending his hand in her direction. She shook her head slightly to get out of her brief daze after focusing on the blonde's features, then reached out and firmly shook his hand. Although she kept her expression neutral, she was instantly taken aback by the warmth his hand radiated. With a warm smile on her face, she replied, Likewise, Lord Naruto. I'm not Lord Naruto. I'm not Councilman Naruto. I'm just Naruto. I hate all my freaking titles, Naruto said somewhat childishly after withholding his hand and rubbing it across his face in frustration. Please don't be like Lee and use the stupid title, he concluded with a groan. After a moment, Korra smiled and said, Okay then, as she began to fully understand his personality. I won't use your title if you don't use mine, she offered as a compromise. Although she was undoubtedly used to being called by that title because it had been used for almost her entire life, she didn't particularly enjoy hearing it used when it wasn't required. After a minute, the blonde said, Heh, fair enough, and gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement. I'm guessing based on your gear that you're ready for our little spar then? The Avatar exclaimed. Yes, with excitement as she shifted her helmet from beneath her arm to above her head, pausing only to tie her ponytail through the opening in the back. I want to get to airbending already, so let's do this, she said. One of the White Lotus men looked curiously at the blonde and said, Korra, Lord Naruto has probably had a long flight to arrive here so early at our request. Perhaps you should allow him to have breakfast first? Despite his brief reaction minutes previously, the blonde sighed inwardly as he heard his title used again. Well, he sounds like a barrel of laughs. Just what I wanted to deal with today, she thought. After silently laughing at the distressed expression the dark-skinned youngster briefly displayed at the idea of extending her test, Naruto responded, Nah, it's alright, adding, I had a small snack on the way here, plus, like I said, I'm nearly as excited for this as Korra here is. Korra's distressed expression abruptly changed to one of ecstasy for a split second before she forced it back to a more neutral one. Despite this, she gave the blonde a very grateful smile. The man nodded in agreement and turned to face the elderly fire-bending master. Very well then, he said. Shall we head down to the sparring area? As he wrenched his eyes from the two teens, Lee said, Yes, with a hint of humor. Let's move into the pavilion, Naruto. I presume you don't need our usual safety equipment. The blonde turned to face the man and said, HM? Oh, nah, with a dismissive wave of his hand. This stuff's all made out of fire silk or our usual leather, he said, pulling along his sleeve before slapping one of his arm guards. This simply meant that his clothing was almost impervious to fire, at least when it came to prolonged exposure to extremely intense flames. Leather was common in the Fire Nation because it was used for their standard-issue armor, but the silk was a rare and valuable material that only the wealthy could hope to be able to afford an entire outfit of. Lee nodded, then simply turned and headed down the stairs of the raised stone section of the compound to a slightly raised arena below it with a wooden pavilion for onlookers to observe. Naruto and Korra trailed behind him, the latter occasionally glancing over at the former out of the corner of her eyes. I can tell he has some serious muscle under his clothes, Korra thought, examining the black silk that clung to his toned biceps. He's probably pretty strong, so I'll have to be careful about letting him get too close. He doesn't look overly bulky either, so he probably isn't too slow. I'm probably still better at hand-to-hand, but I should definitely be careful, Korra thought. Meanwhile, Naruto was considering some of his own strategies. He smirked as he recalled how he had previously been vulnerable to the same thing. From what Tenzin told me, she's going to be rather aggressive, so I should probably try to get her flustered if I can so she makes mistakes, he thought, adding, She's probably all formal bending to boot, so I probably won't have to worry about her dodging as skillfully as pro-benders do. Fast and constant strikes will definitely be a nightmare for her to dodge while trying to throw out any sort of offense. They continued to think as they passed the pavilion where the elders paused and split off on a platform featuring a huge, intricate representation of the White Lotus emblem. The rules are as follows: fire-bending and hand-to-hand combat only. Avoid any intentional blows to the face. You will stop immediately if your opponent concedes. They are knocked out of the ring, or I order you to do so. Do you both understand and accept the rules as I have described them? Yes, the two teenagers agreed, having heard the identical instructions countless times before. Lee said, Very well, you may begin when you're ready. And then there was a little period of silence in the compound. Since it was still early, many of the White Lotus residents were still asleep, so for the time being, it was truly just them. Naruto eventually said, All right, buddy, time to get down, reaching up to remove the fox kit from his head and setting him on the ground. Kurama yipped and then ran off in the direction of the pavilion. You know, I have to admit that I'm surprised, the blonde said, looking at his opponent as he shifted back into his old posture and flexed his muscles. Younger women usually go nuts when they see Kurama before trying to hug him to death, he said. With a sly smile, Korra shot back. Hey, I'm not exactly your average woman. Did you expect me to squeal over how cute he was or something? She went on, flagrantly disregarding the fact that she had fought the need to do precisely what he described since she was so excited for the impending match. Naruto laughed as he shook his arms to continue warming up his muscles. Yes, actually, he said. I guess you're just a special snowflake, he said with a broad smile. Get it, because we're in the South Pole? As Katara put a wrinkled palm to her brow and recalled her brother's unique sense of humor, she abruptly said, Oh dear spirits, even though she was also smiling. Korra shook her head and said, That was such a bad joke, even though she was grinning at the poor word choice. Come on, let's fight already, she said. The blonde sighed and said, Oh fine, cracking his neck before slowly slipping into a classic fire-bending stance. You're no fun, he said. The Avatar responded, I'm plenty of fun, as she moved into her own position. Here, let me show you. To her dismay, Naruto had simply maintained his position and struck each fireball with the open palm of one of his hands. When the fireball made contact, it would appear to have struck successfully but would instead expand in a brief burst of flame before fizzling out. Suddenly, she swung her fists forward in a flurry of punches, each one sending a small fireball towards her target. When he saw that she was looking at him with a hint of surprise, he said, I've sparred elite firebenders of the Fire Nation more times than I could hope to count, Korra. Oftentimes now, I spar more than 5 of them at once. You're going to have to do a bit more than simply throwing a bunch of fire at me if you want to land a solid hit. As the adolescent girl gazed at the blonde in front of her, her startled expression changed to a somewhat sinister smile. As she recalled the time she sparred many other former students of her fire-bending master, she thought, Looks like I finally have someone that can keep up a little. All right, time to get serious. Korra suddenly started running ahead. A moment later, she leaped into the air and did a front flip while extending her right leg. This caused a large wave of fire to shoot in the direction of the blonde. The blonde chuckled silently as he said, Impressive power, but you made far too obvious that this was going to be your move. In response, he extended his hands forward and pressed the tips of his fingers together, creating a wedge-like shape that was directed towards the wave of flame that passed over his body, effectively splitting the wave in half around him. He calmly said, That's a bit better. While the fire appeared to have no impact on his body other than a little steam rolling off his clothing. It was far too predictable with how you threw your entire body into the move though, he said. Korra's eyebrows went up at the criticism she was getting since, although she admitted that her opponent was likely very good, he had not yet demonstrated his superiority, or even bowed to her in reply. As she finished speaking, a jet of flame that was just big enough to reach him came out of her mouth. Fine, she said in a somewhat irritated tone after realizing that she was rather close to him. Then let me show you something even better. Much better. As he inhaled deeply and his eyes slightly widened, Naruto thought excitedly. He felt a familiar burning sensation move from his lungs into his throat. He opened his jaw and let out the built-up flame in a manner akin to Korra's recent action, but there were 2 significant differences between the two. In the first place, he breathed a lot more fire than Korra had just a moment before. Second, his flames were blue, a hue so faint that it might be mistaken for white in some areas. This attracted far more attention than the overwhelming volume of fire. The wave of blue flames surpassed Korra's own small amount, and rushed over her even as she hurled herself to the ground spryly on all fours and dropped herself as much as she could. Underscore 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 Lee murmured. Beautiful as they ever were. As his gaze strayed across the fire his former pupil had started. One of the White Lotus guards turned to face the elderly fire-bending master and sarcastically remarked, "He wields blue fire? Why didn't you warn us about this?" he asked. "I was obviously correct in my assessment, since Katara was undoubtedly aware of this as well," he said calmly, turning to face the others. "I didn't feel that it was something that you needed to be warned about in advance," he said. She gazed at the blue flames that were just now going out and said, "It's true," adding, "Zuko wrote to me a lot back then about how he found a boy who wielded blue fire like Azula did. But even though blue flames burn more intensely than their counterparts, I'm sure that Naruto wouldn't intentionally harm Korra in any way, so there's no need to worry," the other man said. "But the Avatar's safety is at risk here, and this might be too risky for her to handle." As he looked at the other two men and the White Lotus woman who had not yet voiced her opinion, Lee firmly declared, "It is the duty of the Avatar to overcome any obstacle they may face. Dealing with a friendly spar when the opponent wields blue fire could very well be the least of her problems in the future, as we have the best healer in the world here in case Korra is hurt in any way, and this will also be a good learning experience for her since she has rarely found any obstacle she struggles to overcome, so I must insist that this be allowed to continue," Lee said. "I'm inclined to agree with Master Lee and Master Katara," the last female member of the White Lotus team said after a long moment. "The young man doesn't strike me as the type of person to intentionally hurt her short of what a spar permits, and this will likely be a good learning experience as Master Lee has stated. While it is our duty to protect the Avatar, we must not coddle her either. We have permitted other less trustworthy nobles to visit and spar with her for this purpose, and I do not believe that this should be an exception." Despite their little displeasure at the prospect of the bout going on, the two White Lotus warriors returned their attention to the fight. Underscore 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 after the flames appeared to go out, and the strong heat that had been flowing above her subsided, Korra, still in disbelief at what she had witnessed, simply looked up at the blonde in front of her. "Blue fire," the Avatar thought in a moment of wonder. "That was way too close," she added, feeling a definite drop of perspiration go down her neck even though she was in the South Pole. "Now that's what I'm talking about," Naruto joyfully interrupted the teen's thoughts, his voice unaffected by the flames that had just erupted from his throat. "Unpredictable, powerful, and rather quick to boot. Nicely done. You've definitely turned the heat up a notch," he said. The clearing then fell into a spooky calm, broken only by a fleshy slap from one of the seniors in the pavilion who grimaced. At last, the blonde laughed and explained. Get it, because we're fire bending? Man, I'm on fire today! Although Katara's little laugh could also be heard, the clearing was still filled with the sound of another fleshy slap from the pavilion. You are really bad at making jokes, the Water Tribe girl said gravely as she stood very carefully and repositioned herself. Naruto fiercely argued. Hey, my sense of humor is awesome! Before he sighed and shook his head, returning to his basic posture. That aside, I guess we should be back to it, he said. Korra nodded, inhaled a soothing breath through her nose, closed her eyes for a second, and then opened them again, displaying a somewhat more composed and serene expression than she had before displayed. But then, as he bounced on the balls of his feet, the blonde suddenly grinned and shifted his formal stance into something like a boxing stance. A second later, he swung out a rapid jab with each hand, blasting a tiny burst of blue fire towards the Avatar's chest. Korra swiftly countered by simply pushing herself to the right to avoid them, even though her opponent's fireballs had reached her faster than she had initially anticipated. They had been too swift to give her an opportunity to counter with any fire bending of her own, so it was her natural instinct to simply dodge. But even as her gaze returned to Naruto, he was in the midst of another round of short swings that blasted flames in her direction. He had delivered 2 more rapid punches and a thin stream of flame formed by kicking his foot up and back down. In order to give herself some room to counter his quick moves if necessary, Korra pushed herself back a little as she dodged again, letting out a faint growl. She then extended her right foot and swung it in a semicircle along the platform floor, sending a horizontal wave of flame towards the blonde's feet. After seeing what was about to happen, Naruto simply leaped over the flames and spun in midair, sending another wave of flame into the Avatar's chest. Korra let her brow furrow and swiftly thrust both of her fists forward in retaliation, sending another powerful wave of fire in the direction of the blonde that surpassed the little wave he had shot and proceeded to the spot where he would land. To her dismay, though, as soon as the blonde's feet touched the ground, he spun around to avoid her burst of flame. This move wasn't entirely pointless, though, because as he turned back to her, his fist exploded, sending a large burst of blue flame in her direction, which was swiftly followed by several more. As she continued to dodge and counter the blast for several minutes afterward in an endless back and forth, the Water Tribe teenager thought, "This is fucking ridiculous. He isn't actually giving me a chance to go completely on the attack, he just dodges my bending like it's nothing, and the only way I'm going to actually have a chance to hit him is to get in close again and try to beat him there," she said in frustration. As he carelessly tossed his flames around like a pro-bender, the blonde thought, looks like she might finally be thinking of a plan. He was not trying to win the spar, but rather to force the teen to demonstrate her skills. "Well then, let's see what you've thought of to beat me, Korra," he said, ignoring the more complex moves he was familiar with. Her armor was steaming a bit after shielding her from the flames, but suddenly, in the middle of the dodging she had done earlier, Korra used her arms to block some of the small bursts of flame he had thrown. She grunted loudly as she leaped into the air and gave the blonde 2 kicks of flame. Naturally, without thinking, Naruto swung away from them, just as he had done a few times before, noticing that she was now sprinting in his direction with a rather ferocious look on her face. He opened his hand, turned around entirely, and threw a tiny stream of his blue flames from his palm in her direction. However, Korra simply charged through them after positioning her hands in a wedge shape and proceeding. She emerged with steam now rolling off of almost her entire body and proceeded with a pretty predictable haymaker from her right arm. The blonde merely ducked and allowed the blow to pass over his head, grinning a little wider at the display of aggression. But as she inhaled deeply and tried to pull her arms back in what was clearly meant to be a strong fire-bending move, he swiftly extended his arms and locked her hands with his own before she could actually execute it from close range. "You realize that you're a little careless?" As the two soon found themselves pushing against each other in a fast test of raw strength, Naruto asked with a hint of effort in his voice. "Throwing a lot of fire at that range would have backlashed and hit you too. Why is it that everyone claims that I'm not restrained?" From a distance, the perspiration streaming down Korra's brow was clearly visible to anyone who would bother to look. Korra grunted from between her teeth in sudden shock as she used all of her strength to overwhelm the blonde in front of her. "Because you risk harming yourself, just to win a spar," the blonde said with a grunt of effort. His previous smirk reappeared after a brief pause, although his brow was still somewhat furrowed, indicating the work he was exerting on his body. "Although I can respect that," he said loudly as he pushed forward a little more forcefully, gradually pushing the avatar back as she made an even greater effort to push against him. Even as her eyes widened and she staggered slightly from being knocked off balance, the blonde swiftly bent down and swept at her legs, causing her to face plant onto the ground beneath her with a solid thud. Korra was still pushing hard against her blonde opponent when she suddenly felt Naruto's hands ripped out of her own. Then she felt herself stumbling forward as the heavy resistance she had been pushing against suddenly vanished. Master Lee, who was still in the pavilion, called out, "That's enough, Naruto is the winner." The teenager on the ground thought, "I can't believe this," as she kept her head down and said, "He beat me with such a simple trick." "What in the hell, Korra, you're better than this." She then raised her neck slightly before letting her helmeted face fall again and hit the ground a few times. She turned her head to see the blonde who was now squatting next to her. "You'd save a lot of otherwise wasted movement that way. Aside from that and being too aggressive for your own good, you're quite skilled. It was a good spar," he said, smiling warmly at her. "You should think about incorporating your waterbending movements into how you evade until you learn a bit of airbending," he said. After a few moments, Korra said, "Thanks," and then she sighed somewhat. "I suppose I can work on it since it'll be a while before I work on airbending," she added, and then she forced herself to stand up. "What are you saying? Fire should have been the final element you mastered before air, right?" Naruto questioned, standing up straight with her and his head tilted slightly to the side. "Yeah, but Master Lee said that I'd have to beat you before I mastered firebending," the young avatar replied somberly. "I didn't actually expect you to be so much better than the other guys he had me fight before," he said. As they made their way back to the pavilion where the elders were waiting, Naruto retorted, "Ah, I see he's still a fan of that old trick of his," noticing the teen's curious expression. "He once told me that I'd have to beat 10 elite firebenders at once before he would say that I mastered firebending," he explained. "Elite firebenders? T10. Knowing that members of that specific group, with the exception of a few others like the Fire Lord, possessed extraordinary fire-bending abilities, Korra asked in a moment of shock. She could likely handle 2 or 3 at a time using only her own fire-bending abilities, but even she thought it was absurd to take on 10 at once. Naruto smacked her shoulder and turned to face the elders they had approached. "Mom, he reportedly usually sets some absurdly difficult challenge before he will say you're a master, though many others would still say you've earned the title," he said. "Isn't that correct, Master Lee?" To his credit, The man was able to maintain a straight face for a few seconds before his appearance was marred by a slight upturn at the edges. As Korra turned to face the blonde with a dropped jaw, he said, "I suppose that's true, Master Naruto." With a somewhat wider smile. "You really defeated 10 elite firebenders in one go?" After he finished, he moved the fox up to his scalp, where he spun around a few times before lying down over his spiky locks again. Yes, I did," the blonde said with a nostalgic smile as he squatted down to pick up Kurama from the pavilion floor. "I don't ever intend to do something like it again if I can help it, but it was a good challenge at the time," he said. After a moment, he turned to face Lee and further said, "To answer the question I have a hunch that you'll undoubtedly ask me, the fact that she can use Dragon's Breath *** should tell you all that you need to know, and I think she's more than ready to move on. The only major issues I saw were that she seemed overly aggressive, or lacked restraint as it were, and needed to incorporate the other elements into her movements. These are things that would probably be best taught while she learns airbending." Lee questioned in a somewhat sadistic manner, "Are you so certain she is ready to move on?" She didn't appear to do so well during the spar. As he found himself utterly delighted in watching Korra's face flash through a range of emotions. "Oh please," Naruto said absently, reaching up to scratch the fox behind one of its ears. "You know as well as I do that if it would have been nearly anyone else in that ring instead of me, that Korra would have likely won easily. She is ready to move on and master the rest of fire bending on her own time." "So?" Korra questioned excitedly from the side, and everybody could tell by her body language how excited she was. "If there is anyone who can teach her what she needs to learn, especially about the spiritual side of being the Avatar, which she still needs to learn, it's Tenzin," Katara said quietly from the side as she gazed at the two teens in front of her. "I suppose I believe she is ready as well," he said while tugging at his mouth. "I have known fantastic firebenders that would have been blasted out of the ring in moments against Naruto, even with him holding back a fair amount. To have managed to fight against him for a few minutes, even if it was mostly just dodging and countering, is certainly commendable," the most vocal member of White Lotus said. "I think we're inclined to agree after that display." After turning to face his fellow members. "Very well then, it is time to begin your airbending training, Korra," he said. "Yes. Finally!" Korra exclaimed as she sprang into the air. Upon landing and saw the deadpan looks that were aimed at her, she, gracefully, adjusted her countenance and simulated coughing into her palm. She made a formal bow and said, "Thank you all for believing in me," before turning slowly and grinning broadly and sprinting to another area of the complex. The news that she would finally be trained in the one thing she had not yet been able to access effectively had brightened her day. As he watched the adolescent dash off grinning, Naruto said, "Well, she was definitely just as lively as everyone told me she would be." "Yes," said Lee, softly laughing now that his pupil was out of the room. "Lively is definitely a good word to describe her most of the time." "That's definitely true," Katara said, looking at the blonde with a little nostalgic smile on her lips. "But then again, I think you could really connect to that." Maybe a little," Naruto said sheepishly as he scratched his cheek and looked away. He held it there for a short while before he let out a deep sigh and turned back to face the woman. "Fitting descriptions of my personal life aside, however, I have some business I need to get out of the way with Chief Tonrak while I'm here. If it isn't too much trouble, might I be able to have an audience with him before we move on to more pleasant topics of conversation?" The seniors, who were not Lee, raised their eyebrows a few inches on their faces as they gazed at the teenager after seeing his abrupt change in tone. With a tiny smile pulling at her lips once again, Katara remarked, Zuko definitely wasn't exaggerating when he said you were a lot like Sokka, making terrible jokes one moment and diving headfirst into politics the next. A tiny smile of his own twitched up the blonde's lips in return. He bowed slightly and said, It is an honor to be compared to one of my personal heroes, clearly struggling to maintain a neutral expression on his face. At least he isn't around to hear you say something like that. The elderly waterbending master laughed softly. He would have let that go to his head and ego rather quickly, however. I suppose I shouldn't delay you any longer with my rambling. Come, I'll escort you to see Tonrak myself. Underscore 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 underscore. A few minutes later, as Katara and the blonde firebender strolled along the carved path to Tonrak's hut, Katara's elderly voice asked softly, So, is this your first time in the South Pole? It is indeed, he replied with a stern smile. I've always wondered about what it was like here, but I never had a good opportunity to visit before now, really? I would have presumed Zuko would make that a priority for you to get out and experience the world a bit before becoming the councilman in Republic City. I brought up the very same thing around 2 years ago before I moved, actually. Naruto laughed. Though I was eager to go back there to see my friends again, I thought I'd need more experience before becoming a politician for the entire country. In response, though, he and Fire Lord Izumi made me sit down to drink tea with them and tried to explain that it would be more efficient if I studied under their current councilwoman for a few months instead of traveling the world. In hindsight, though, they seemed to say that in as roundabout manner as possible. So they I-wrote you then? Yes, I suppose they did. The brunette replied with a second chuckle. Zuko is rather fond of using that particular method to try to teach some big lesson to me, and it seems his daughter picked up the habit as well. It was only when Lady My sat me down and explained it that I learned it was also his uncle's favorite way of teaching him. The waterbending master remarked quietly and with a broad smile. Oh, it really was from what I understand, adding that Iroh and Aang would sit and chat for hours, on what few occasions they had free time together, that is. Yes, from what I've heard of both of them, it seemed like the two would get along famously. Oh my, yes, in fact, though many people don't know this, I think Aang got along better with Iroh more than even Sokka, Toph, or Zuko. They were always so like-minded, especially when it came to the problems of the world. That isn't so surprising, all things considered. The brunette said slowly. Zuko did always say that Aang wasn't his favorite amongst your group, even if they did get along famously. Oh? Katara said, raising an eyebrow as she looked at the teenager. Who was it then? She asked. I wonder. Naruto replied, turning to face her and grinning mischievously. After a few moments of staring at each other, Katara finally laughed from the bottom of her heart as they got closer to their goal. Oh yes, I can certainly see why Zuko and Tenzin praise you as a councilman. You give me just enough to bait me into the conversation and then leave me wanting more. Quite skillful, young man, quite skillful indeed. The blonde responded. Maybe I'm not quite as good as you say if you caught me so easily. When you get to be my age, it's a bit easier to pick up on such things. The elderly lady replied gently. For one so young, I can tell that you hold incredible potential. The two bending masters were approaching when a voice from the igloo said, "Why yes, why yes, why yes, why yes, why yes, why yes." The voice was somewhat muffled, but it was clearly feminine, and could only be that of the Avatar. "Well, someone's excited. Korra has always been particularly excitable about anything relating to airbending, seeing as she tapped into the other three elements incredibly easily. I'm sure you could understand why that is." Before the blonde could react, a woman from the water tribe, who was slightly over 5 feet tall, emerged from the front of the igloo with her eyes closed, and her face glowing with wonder at what she saw. She was also gently massaging her temples. "Katara!" she exclaimed as she hurried up and gave the old woman a tight hug. She then drew away and briefly looked at Naruto before going back to the waterbending master. "Not that I mind, but what are you doing all the way out here?" she asked. Katara waved him and said, "This is Councilman Naruto from Republic City. I'm sure Korra has no doubt filled you in on what happened earlier." "It's good to see you too, Senna," Katara said. The mother said softly, "Ah yes, she's celebrating," as the muffled voice of Korra reverberated from within the hut. "You'll have to forgive my daughter, she can be a bit rough in her spars from what I understand," she said. The blonde replied with a gentle smile of his own. "It's quite all right, ma'am. I've dealt with far worse in my time." Yip, as Senna's eyes flitted to his hair and her smile widened at the sight, Naruto said, Yeah, I'm getting to you," with a tiny huff. After a moment, he reached up and removed the creature from his head and held it in his arms. He went on, pushing his arms out from his body to hold the fox out to the woman of the water tribes, saying, "This little demon is Kurama, and he can get rather upset when not properly introduced." Senna put both of her hands on the creature's cheeks and then gave it a loving head rub, crooning, "Well, aren't you a little cutie? You can hold him if you'd like." Without hesitation, Korra's mother took the young fox into her arms and proceeded to coo at him like a newborn baby, almost tearing it from his grasp. "I take it this happens often? That's why I was actually surprised when Korra didn't do the same thing," the blonde said in response to Katara, laughing. Far more often than I would like to admit," she said. "I see," said the waterbending master, grinning amusedly. After a brief pause, Naruto said, "If the typical reactions are anything to go by, she'll probably be distracted for quite some time." "You're probably right. Let's head on inside. I imagine you're at least a little cold by now in those clothes." As they entered the igloo without knocking or making any other noise to indicate their presence, Naruto said, "Not at all, actually," adding, "I've been told that my body burns at a slightly higher temperature than most, and these clothes actually cover me pretty well." After giving him a fleeting glance, Katara swiftly turned away and shook her head, huffing slightly. "Firebenders and their body temperature," she said. Fortunately, the noises of Korra's excited shrieking had stopped by this point, but it also meant that the two bending masters' brief talk could be easily overheard. Before its owner went inside the main living quarters, a male voice yelled out from the next room in the big igloo. "Katara, is that you I hear?" The man was tall and eye level with Naruto. He had a rather broad frame and was dressed in traditional water tribe robes. His dark hair was temporarily pulled back into a simple ponytail, and as soon as he noticed the unfamiliar presence, his gaze instantly went to the blond man in the room. "Tonrak," Katara said cheerfully, naming the man's appearance. "It's nice to see you again after so long," she said as she moved forward, only to be swept into an embrace. He said politely, "Just as it is you, Katara," before focusing to the other man in the room. "But it appears you've brought me a visitor," he said. She pointed to the blonde and said, I have, before introducing herself. This is Councilman Naruto from Republic City, she said. The chief of the Southern Water Tribe simply lifted his eyebrows in a real moment of surprise at this, and his mouth briefly hung open before he swiftly closed it again. He finally cleared his face of his obvious amazement and said, My apologies, Councilman. I'd heard about your age, but I honestly didn't expect someone so young. The blonde said nonchalantly, Please don't bother with my titles, Chief Tonrak. But he kept a serious expression on his face. As for my age, I get that sort of reaction at least once a week, so there's no harm done, he said. Very well, Naruto, was it? I assume since you had Katara escort you here that you're here to speak to me about something? Indeed, the brunette said with a smile. I've been asked by Fire Lord Izumi to negotiate an agreement to allow some Fire Nation vendors to come in for your Glacial Spirits Festival later this year if you aren't completely opposed to the idea. The chief's eyes expanded rather comically at the first thought, and his brows raised again before he schooled his expression again. I use this next room over to keep my papers in. If you'd like to step inside, we can talk over things. I imagine this might take quite some time, he said, trying to control his excitement at the thought of how much money and trade Fire Nation vendors could bring in for the tribe at the festival. Naruto turned to face Katara and bowed, saying, Unfortunately, I feel you may be right. Thank you for escorting me here. It was greatly appreciated, he said. Oh please, it was no trouble at all, Katara said. I assume you will at least be staying overnight to rest? She asked in a kind manner. Most likely, he replied with a deep breath. I get the hunch that this will take a while, and Iroh has flown from Republic City to the Fire Nation Palace, and then to the South Pole in the last 5 days. He needs to rest for at least a day. I will ensure there's a room for you at the White Lotus compound then. It's the very least we can do for you since you came all this way, even if it was for some business of your own, he said. Thank you for your hospitality then. And then he turned back to face the big guy. Shall we then, Chief Tonrak? He said. The man ushered him inside and said, After you, brushing aside the hanging skins that kept the house's rooms warm before pursuing him. Underscore 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 underscore. After 8 hours, as was to be expected, Naruto muttered to himself, I hate being a councilman, as he strode back towards the White Lotus compound with Kurama atop his scalp once more. The previous 8 hours had been spent outlining the possible agreement between the Fire Nation and the Southern Water Tribe. But there were so many details that he and Tonrak had skipped an entire meal in order to finish the work as soon as possible. Yuppie, sighed the blonde, muttered again. I swear, you're no help sometimes, as he arrived at the compound's gate. The sun was finally setting, turning the sky a stunning orange, which was his favorite color, and he had to stop for a moment to take it all in. He then quickly made his way inside the compound and headed for the spacious housing area that was kept close to the back. He was crossing the large stone platform in front of the large, wooden housing unit when he heard a familiar, animated voice ask, Naruto? His eyes instantly locked onto the form of Korra and Katara standing together a fair distance away from a small group of White Lotus guards, bringing him back to reality. Hey Korra, he said, waving slightly before putting it to his lips to suppress a yawn. What's going on? He said. As Katara grinned wistfully by her side, she screamed. Tenzin and the others are coming, that's what! Katara figured I'd pass, so she actually called him here early and he's due any time now. I finally get to start my airbending training, she said. With an arched eyebrow, the blonde asked, Tenzin? Is he supposed to stay here and teach you or something? From the girl's side, Katara verified. He is, grinning broadly. It will be so nice to see my grandchildren for a while again, she said. Strange. I wonder whether Tenzin intends to bring Korra back with him. Tenzin, of all people, seems hesitant to leave Republic City at this time. Would you mind if I join you while waiting for them all then? It has been a while since I got to spend some time with the airbenders. Without hesitation, Katara replied, Of course you can, adding, I'm sure they will be ecstatic to see you. After a short period, Korra said earnestly, Hey, while we wait, what was that fire bending you did earlier today? It was so much quicker than what I was taught, Korra said. The blonde responded, You mean the stance I took where I sort of bounced on my feet? He didn't actually choose to adopt the stance because doing so would have resulted in an irate fox perched upon his head. Korra simply nodded back, focusing all of her attention on him to get an answer. It's the style that probenders use in Republic City. I hear some of the guards talking about it all the time, so I really want to see a match sometime, Korra asked, sounding even more interested than before. Are you a fan? If she's going to have to hear about that secondhand, they really ought to let her out to see more. I suppose you could say that I'm a fan, yes, he said with a slight grin. I have a friend in Republic City who was on a probending team, so he got me into it. Last year, the firebender who was working with him and another friend of mine quit, so they all but guilt-tripped me into playing for their team this year. With her curiosity piqued once again, Korra exclaimed, Wait, what? You're a probender on top of everything else? Yeah, the brunette said with a small sigh. It's killing what little personal time I actually had, but it's to help out two of my first friends. I can't exactly just tell them no when they really need something from me, you know? The teenager heard his justification and said, Oh, I see, with a little stifled enthusiasm. Well, what team do you play for? The Akimichi Fire Shadows, the Fire Shadows? Korra asked briefly before raising her eyebrows almost to her hairline. You're the firebender for the reigning champions? She exclaimed. I am, the blonde said, smiling again at her obvious pleasure. If you'd like, I can show you some tips and such about how different bending styles are different sometime. Hell yeah! Korra cried, but Katara's glance caused her to settle down once more. A moment later, the blonde thought, Well, actually, no reason not to start right now. All right, are you aware with the general rules of the matches? The avatar asked more questions than it answered. You try to knock people back spaces, right? In gist, yes, that's the objective, Naruto replied with a smile. There are a few other rules involved, but that isn't particularly important to understand the style. Now, it's a 3 versus 3 matchup where you don't want to get knocked back, so what do you think the most important ability that a probender has to have is? After giving it some thought, the Water Tribe teen said, Speed? Close, and granted, speed is an important aspect, however, that's not quite right. The most important ability that any probender has to have is the ability to dodge. I know that seems a bit too simplified, but if you don't get hit, then you don't get knocked back. After a short pause, the teenager nodded and said, Okay, I could see that. So the styles focus on being able to dodge then? Good deduction, replied the brunette. Yes, as you can probably notice if you think back and look at how I reacted to your attacks, you can see how the stance allowed me to stay light on my feet and move at a moment's notice. That fundamental aspect will remain the same in the pro bending arena regardless of what type of bending it is. After a rather long silence, the Avatar said, "That's so different than what I was taught. It was quite different than what I had been taught too," Naruto said with a snort. "However, you'll likely pick it up much quicker than your formal bending training when you get in some practice with it. I know that I certainly did." After that, there was a relaxed quiet. Before anyone else decided to engage in any more small talk, they heard the familiar roar of a sky bison, which made them all grin for different reasons. The voice of a girl who sounded like a child repeatedly said, Ariat, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? As the bison finally touched down on the platform. When the commotion subsided, a weary man's voice said, "Yes, Ikki, as I've been saying for the last 15 minutes, we are finally here," Naruto yelled. "Now Tenzin, you know Ikki's just a bit excitable," as he glanced up at the big saddle. Ikki and Milo instantly leaped from their positions on the creature and effortlessly used airbending to carry themselves over into him, crashing into him in a rather fierce hug for such young children. "Big brother, why are you here? Aren't you cold in those clothes? Were you waiting here long? Where's Iroh? Do you always carry a sword with you when you're gone? Are you and Korra secretly dating?" He inhaled deeply after letting out a little sigh at the flurry of inquiries from the bald councilman's younger daughter. "I'm here for a few different reasons, Ikki. No, I'm not cold in these clothes. I was only waiting on you for the past 10 or 15 minutes, as I didn't even know you were supposed to be here today. Iroh is inside their stables resting. I usually carry my sword with me when I'm gone, but not always. Seeing as I just met Korra today, I'm fairly certain we aren't dating." He concluded by sticking out his tongue at the young lady. He held the bald youngster at arm's length and said, "Now," before removing the tiny figure that was clinging to his chest, "how's my little brother been? Get into any trouble recently?" he asked. With a broad smile, he exclaimed, "I learned a new move. Put me down and let me show you really quick." Following his instructions, Naruto saw Milo crouch down and appeared to concentrate attentively before he immediately blasted off towards his grandmother, and the sound of a particular bodily function was detected. "Jinora," he said, noticing the preteen girl who had just approached him quietly. "Please tell me that Milo didn't do what I just think he did," he said. The preteen said softly, "Be glad you weren't there when he first figured it out." And then he looked up. "Mom and Dad had to talk to him a lot to get him to stop calling it fart bending," the preteen said. "Of course they did," the firebender replied with barely suppressed laughter, as he struggled to control a rather childish chuckle. "Anyway," he added, squatting to bring her closer to eye level after realizing Ikki had also hovered over to Katara and the others. Fully standing, she approached him up to about mid-abdomen, so his new height worked out well. "How's my favorite airbender been lately?" he asked. The young airbender said, "I've been well, mostly spending time studying the old airbending scrolls," with a faint color on her cheeks. Speaking of," the blonde said, opening the bag on his right side and searching for a while before extracting a scroll. He held it up to the young girl after opening it for an inch or two to make sure it was the proper one. What's? You're still interested in fire-bending breathing techniques, yes?" I mean yes." Jinora trailed off a little self-consciously before gathering herself. "I just saw how much you benefited from studying ours, so," she said. "You can keep this if you promise to keep it safe, okay?" We don't have too many scrolls on techniques written by the Dragon of the West, so we want to keep them in good condition, he said, smiling softly at the girl who was clearly a little infatuated with him. She exclaimed, Why you giving me a scroll written by Iroh? Before putting both hands over her mouth, as her cheeks turned scarlet with shame at her overt display of delight. Despite the other people's eyes still on them, the blonde clarified with a quiet giggle. A scroll written by Iroh from my personal collection, yes. Adding, think of it as a little early birthday present, okay? The young airbender finally reached forward and held the scroll in her arms while looking down at it with affection. She nodded after a moment of turning her still flushed face up. Thank you. With a broad smile, Naruto said, You're welcome, inadvertently causing the little girl's face to blush even more. Now we should probably go chat with your parents and see what's going on, he said. Tenzin was assisting his wife in carefully sliding down the sky bison's enormous tail when the blonde finally finished handling each of the airbending children one at a time, and went up to the others. The airbending master said, Careful, careful, as she went down and eventually stood up. The woman snorted in a slightly irritated voice. Tenzin, stop dotting on me. I'm not some defenseless damsel in distress. I'm just pregnant. But before she could say another word, Katara appeared and gave her a swift, tender hug before putting her hands lightly on her swollen belly. The elderly waterbender said, The baby is quite strong. I sense another airbender in the future. Oblivious to Pema's startled expression. Ouch, sorry Pema, Naruto said, finally directing the woman's and her husband's full attention to him. She shook her head and remarked, Oh well, before adding, All I want is just one non-bender that doesn't blast wind in my face every 5 seconds. Tenzin said sweetly, It will be alright, dear, and then gave her a side cheek kiss. Councilman, he said, looking directly at Naruto. Not that it isn't nice to see you again, but what are you doing here? My official business here is done, Tenzin, no need to be so formal, he said with a grin. To sate your curiosity, though, Korra's firebending instructor brought me in to spar her and I had to propose and formalize an agreement with Chief Tonrak. I honestly didn't even know you were coming here until around 10 or so minutes ago, the tall man said. I see. Clearly at ease after hearing the news. That's good. With a little smile, Naruto said, You need to relax, my friend. You're too stiff from dealing with the council, raising your kids, and supporting your expectant wife. I know, but it's just so difficult to find time to get away. He trailed off, but then he looked up and saw the person not far behind his mother. Korra? He asked. The adolescent in question hurried forward, grinning, and stood in front of the towering airbender. Look at you, he said adoringly as he swiftly scanned her body. You've developed into quite the young avatar. Master Tenzin, she said politely, bowing slightly. I can't express how delighted I am to see you. I can't wait to begin my airbending training. The man said, Yes, well, before averting his eyes sheepishly and rubbing the back of his neck. Korra clearly saw the action and started to stare at him and the others with some suspicion. Pema offered from her husband's side, placing an arm lightly on the crook of his elbow. You're going to have to tell her sooner or later, Katara abruptly said, more than inquired. You aren't staying, pointing out that none of their little possessions were there. Hearing his mother's dissatisfied tone of voice, the airbending master said, No, I'm afraid we're not, with a countenance that was clearly a little hurt. We're only staying for the night, then I have to return to Republic City, he said. Korra shook her head, perplexed. But no, you're supposed to move here to teach me. she said. I'm sorry, Korra, but your airbending training will have to wait. The blonde sighed inwardly as he saw her rather distraught countenance, thinking, there's no way she's going to let it end with just hearing that. I'm calling it right now, he said. Underscore 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 underscore. After 45 minutes, as everyone sat down to lunch inside the White Lotus compound, Korra inquired, so, how long until you're able to start teaching me? A few days, a week, a month? He sat between Milo and Jinora, the former cramming his cheeks while the latter gently petted Kurama, who was curled up securely in her lap. Called it, the blonde thought, applauding himself inwardly for his previous deduction that the problem had not been fixed. Tenzin put down his bowl of Water Tribe noodles and said, it honestly may be much longer than that. At the head of the table. I don't understand why you can't start teaching me. His eyes darted to the blonde. Korra, I have a responsibility to Republic City, and the situation there is very unstable right now, he said. Yes, but you also have a responsibility to teach me airbending. Believe me, I'd be happy to try to find another airbending master, but you're the only one. We're stuck with one another. Tenzin sighed as he lifted his hand and scratched his forehead. I understand that, Korra, he said. I'm sorry for having to postpone this further, but there's nothing I can do. As everyone at the table turned to face him, Naruto said, Tenzin, I feel you're overlooking an obvious answer here. And then he shrugged his shoulders casually before responding. Why not just bring her to Republic City? With her eyes brightening, Korra almost exclaimed, That's perfect! As he slapped his palm off the table, one of the older White Lotus members exclaimed, Republic City is far too dangerous. Avatar Aang tasked us with keeping you safe. Avatar Aang tasked the White Lotus with helping future avatars achieve their true potential, which was certainly understandable given the difficulty he had doing so, by forcefully keeping her here, even though I am aware as to why, Naruto said, squinting his eyes slightly at the man. I feel that you are failing in that very task, he said, briefly catching Tenzin's attention. Korra gave him a grateful look at that, but the other adults in the room, with the exception of Pema and Katara, gave him a very stern look for implying something they still wanted to keep secret. With a quick glance at Tenzin, the Water Tribe kid said, I highly doubt Aang would want me locked up here like a prisoner. With a sigh, Tenzin said, I know this is difficult to accept, anticipating the response. But now is not the right time for you to come to Republic City. I'm sorry, Korra, but the answer is no, he said. Fine, whatever, Korra said shortly after, growling in frustration as she hurried to her feet and left the dining room. The two old men sighed again as the door slammed shut much louder than normal. Naruto looked at the airbending master and said, You are foolish to keep her away from this. As he carefully pulled Kurama away from Jinora and got to his feet, he bit out a little harsher than normal, saying, I know your views on the matter, but as I said, Councilman, she isn't ready. Then allow me to leave you on this parting thought, Councilman, he said with such force that it caused those around the table to gasp at his voice. No one in their right mind would have considered your father ready to face the Fire Lord when he did, but he still accomplished it because it was what the world needed at the time. I'm aware you're trying to protect her until she's prepared for what she's going to face, but keeping the Avatar locked away in a compound for years is hardly the way to prepare her for dealing with Republic City, or the world in general. He calmly strode out of the room and softly closed the door behind him. Tenzin and the White Lotus Elder let their shoulders droop slightly, and even Pema, Katara, and the children, who were not the target of the slight venom in his tone, looked slightly chastised. Since no one moved to defend themselves, he left the room without saying anything. It was debatable whether or not that had a greater impact than Korra's slam. After some time, Pema said, "Well, that was different," in an attempt to ease the tension that persisted in the air even after the blonde left. "I don't think I'd ever seen Naruto upset before," she said. "The subject of the Avatar is touchy with him," she replied softly after a few seconds. "He and the leaders of the Fire Nation are in agreement that we shouldn't have been holding Korra here like we are any longer. Any time he wants to bring it up in conversation, I usually speak with him privately so you wouldn't have to see that. He made some good points though, Dad," Jinora said, a little bashful, from the side. Despite her obvious love for the child, she could see the merit in what he said. "He always does," Tenzin sighed loudly after whispering. "I know he did, sweetheart. Just loud enough for everyone to hear." Underscore 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 underscore. The morning after, Ikki yelled, "Bye, Gran!" just before Iggy left, leaving a stoic-looking Naruto and a waving Katara watching after them as a tear trickled down her cheek. He had already said his heartfelt goodbyes to Pema and the kids before they left, so he felt no need to say anything more. Tenzin, however, had only gotten a stiff handshake. After witnessing her family depart, Katara said, "I take it you're probably leaving soon as well?" in a voice that was still a little emotional. "Yeah, probably within the next few minutes," the brunette replied with a head nod. "I'm sorry for the unpleasantness I likely caused last night during dinner. By the way, I feel a bit guilty about ruining what little time with your family you probably get." "It's quite all right," the elderly lady replied with a sniffle. "Truth be told, I agree with what you said. My husband wouldn't have wanted Korra to be held here. She needs to be out in the world in order to learn what makes the Avatar. Well, the Avatar. It's good to know that the Fire Nation isn't completely alone in their opinion," Naruto said following a little pause. "Do you happen to know where Korra is, by the way? I was hoping to speak with her before I left." She's probably just outside of the compound on a nearby cliff if I know her as well as I think I do. I'm sure if you fly out that direction that you'll spot her easily enough." "I see. Well, thank you again for your hospitality, Katara. I greatly appreciate you welcoming me here," he said with a bow. She replied with a gentle smile. "The pleasure was mine, Naruto." Underscore 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 underscore. A few minutes later, as he mounted the dragon's saddle and reached forward to scratch the scales above its brow, Naruto said, "Ready to go, buddy?" Kurama was resting on his scalp as usual. The response Iroh got was a little flap of its wings and a loud rush of air pouring out of its nostrils. "All right, well, it's going to be a short flight at first. After that, It'll be a long haul and you'll get to stretch your wings again. Let's go. Iroha's wings extended out and flapped powerfully at his command, forcing a number of White Lotus members nearby to crouch close to the ground to avoid being knocked over. Naruto allowed his eyes to wander over the surrounding terrain as the black dragon rose from the earth. After a short while of searching, he located his target. He said, "Over there, Iroh," while his wings flailed. "Land us next to the Avatar." After a few seconds and a startled look on Korra's face, the blonde was standing on his saddle, staring down at the teenage girl who had her eyes fixed on the dragon before her. "Hello again, Korra," he said warmly as her gaze briefly strayed to him before returning to the dragon that was no more than a foot from her face. As he reluctantly raised his hand, she returned the greeting. Hey, asking, "Would you mind if I?" He laughed and patted the creature on the brow once again. "Not my call, you'll have to ask Iroh here," he shot back. When the Water Tribe adolescent nodded, she looked into the dragon's eyes. After a few seconds of maintaining eye contact, Iroh's head bowed toward her. Korra then reached forward and caressed his muzzle before gently stroking it a few times. "It would seem that he likes you." For a brief minute, he only got a kind grin until the teenager eventually wrenched her eyes away from the stunning creature. After a few moments to collect his thoughts, he added, "I'll be blunt with you, Korra," adding, "Tenzin wasn't lying when he said that Republic City is unstable, but unlike him, I think that we'll need your help to settle things down." The girl's brow furrowed at this. "What do you mean?" "No one really tells me much of anything that's going on there." In response to the frustration the group has been voicing, Naruto sighed and said, "There's a new group in the city that call themselves the Equalists. To put it simply, they're a group of people who believe that benders are oppressing non-benders in everyday life and want it to be made illegal outside of certain circumstances," Naruto said. Korra said, "But that's... It sounds ridiculous, I know," the blonde replied with a soft chuckle. "However, a lot of the crime in Republic City is done by benders. People who suffered under them then become rather prejudiced against the art itself regardless of the fact that it is neither innately good nor evil. They've been gaining a lot of support lately, so the United Republic Council is trying to do what we can to prevent a civil war from breaking out. That's why Tenzin couldn't move down here just yet." Before letting out a long sigh, the teenager said gently, "Oh, I guess that makes sense still though, why didn't he just tell me that?" "While I don't know for certain, I presume he merely wants to protect you." The brunette snorted. "Of course he does." After a moment, Korra asked, "How about you then?" "As I said, I think that we need your help to ultimately resolve the issue. As the only person in the world that can manipulate all four elements at once, you could easily be classified as the ultimate or most powerful bender in the world. I think if the people of Republic City saw the Avatar standing up for them once again, that this nonsense about benders subjugating normal citizens would be easily resolved." I see," Korra replied, her face looking a little serious. "That being said, I also wanted to stop and chat with you because I heard that there just so happens to be a Republic City supply ship leaving port here tonight. I was interested in a rumor I overheard about the cargo bays and them being rather roomy. But I don't suppose you would know about that sort of thing offhand, would you?" The Avatar's eyes briefly widened in recognition before she tried to control her face after pausing briefly to probably consider why he would ask her such a bizarre question. "I wouldn't know, I've never been in one," she said slowly as she considered taking the chance. "Ah, shame then," Naruto said with a clearly fabricated sense of disappointment. "I had assumed you might have been in one before, as I've heard that the South Pole has fairly loose security around their ships at night." the Avatar said in a monotone. Sorry to disappoint, as her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. I'll leave you be though, as I can see you have something you're working through, but I hope to see you in Republic City sometime soon, Korra, the firebender said, waving a hand in front of his face as if to reject the apology. Don't worry, it's no big deal, he said. Yeah, Korra said absent-mindedly once more before shaking her head and returning to her thoughts. Yeah, I hope to see you there too, she said. Yip. It appears Kurama shares that sentiment. Until then. Naruto grinned and nodded his head in the direction of the girl. Let's go, Iroh, he said. Iroha's wings swiftly seized the air and carried them home toward Republic City as they ran forward and dove off the cliff without any further encouragement.